Excellent. Thank you very much. So as you all know, climate change remains one of the challenging tasks we have faced in recent history. And as our friends in Boston would say, it's a wicked problem, a super wicked problem. It is extremely complicated because simply of the sheer complexity of the problem. We have many agents, institutions that are culprits, that are part of those emitting greenhouse gas emissions, and so finding a solution to that is not easy. It is particularly hard because our economies have long rested on fossil fuels to a large extent, to nuclear power in a lesser extent, and that has provided us with cheap and affordable energy for a long time. And our societies have essentially been designed in a way to accommodate fossil fuels, which has led Greg Unruh to call that a carbon lock-in. Carbon is both economically affordable and politically powerful, which explains why it's so hard to deal with climate change. So for a long time, governments have tried to deal with this issue, trying to raise the price of carbon and other greenhouse gases. This has not been extremely successful, and we can imagine why trying to make people pay more is not going to work very well politically speaking. This has meant that governments have looked for other solutions, and one has been to try to find a way to rely on clean technology, especially renewable energy, to try to decarbonize our economies. And so this is the idea behind this notion of a clean energy transition. Can we move away from fossil fuels toward renewables, such as sun power, water power, wind power, to try to fuel our modern economies? This has long been a technological challenge. Renewables are quite different from coal. They are more finicky in some sense, but many countries have tried to jump into it. And if you flip the slide, many countries have tried to jump into it, and to some degree, quite successfully so. So this is the average production of electricity coming from renewable energy sources, excluding hydropower. The blue line, which is now at the bottom, is the US, which currently generates between 5 and 10% of its electricity from renewables, again, excluding hydropower. And the darker line is the European Union. It's the average for the European Union, which comes out just short of 20%. So this has been quite a change. We also need to be transparent, is that even though the change, at least in the European Union, looks quite dramatic, worldwide, renewables still represent a small share of our energy needs. And in fact, worldwide, in terms of electricity, that's only about 6% or so. So it is not quite there if we think about a complete energy transition. So this raises a couple of issues. So first of all, will comprehensive energy transition actually happen, right? We are now relying on this if we want to deal with climate change. We're relying on these lines to go up even more. So will this happen? And if yes, will it happen fast enough? Again, we now are also time constrained, and so the question is, will this happen within a reasonable amount of time? Because it is perhaps one thing to say that in 100 years we'll be there, but that might be too late. And this is a highly contentious debate. So we have some studies, one famously by Mark Jacobson at Stanford, who offered a testimony in the US Congress, who claims that it's quite feasible and affordable to switch to an almost full energy transition, a full clean energy transition based mostly on wind, water, and solar, with it by 2050 and even to 80% by 2030. Now, if that's indeed affordable and achievable, that's quite a game changer, right? That means that we can get there if we implement the right types of policies. Now, this has also led to some pushback, even among environmentalists. A study from last year by Christopher Clack has pushed back and said, no, this is actually not quite doable the way Jacobson is claiming it is. And of course, the media picked up on this debate because we have environmentalists against environmentalists, claiming opposite scenarios for the future. And of course, that means that the issue has now been politicized. This has also led to a massive back and forth with one institution suing the other. We'll not get into these details, But to just highlight how politicized it is, noted energy expert and part-time actor Mark Ruffalo has also weighed in and mentioned that don't be tricked into going backward with dangerous, dirty, and expensive nuclear energy and their fossil fuel backers, right? So the debate that I want to talk about, that I want to conduct today, will revolve around these questions. And the three main questions I'd like to kind of use today is going to be about the current situation of renewable energy in Europe, the current situation in renewable energy in the US, and finally expand that a bit more around the world. Finally, just to highlight how political this is and how current it is, yesterday President Trump announced that he would impose tariffs on imported solar panels, and as JJ mentioned, washing machines. So this is currently the type of debates we're having. What kind of policy should be implemented? Which one will help down the road promote renewable energy? Is that a desirable thing? And so forth and so on. So for this, again, I mentioned the three leading questions that will be at the heart of our conversation today. First of all, what explains the European success? And perhaps I should have put success in quotation marks, because it is only a partial success, right? So I want to hear more from our guests today about what did Europe do well? What are the threats that are currently at risk for the renewable energy industry in Europe? Then we'll move to the United States to think both about opportunities and also about threats. And finally, we'll expand to the rest of the world. So this is the plan for our conversation. So we'll start asking these questions, and I'll start with Jonas Meckling, who's joining us from the University of Berkeley, where he's leading the Energy and Environmental Policy Lab. Jonas holds a PhD from the London School of Economics. He has published extensively in all the right journals, Science, Nature, Energy, and so forth. He's also the author of a couple of books, the latest of which is Carbon Coalitions, Business, Climate Politics, and the Rise of Emissions Trading at MIT Press. Interestingly for us, and that's why I'm starting with you, is that you've also served as a senior advisor to the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, and you worked at the European Commission. And so, Jonas, you have lived some of these events, both sides of the issue, both on the policy side and now more on the academic side. And I'd like perhaps if you could summarize a bit for us, what did Europe in general, Germany in particular, do right? How did they achieve the levels of renewable energy deployment that they have? And I'm especially thinking that it was not a given, right? If we had had this conversation 15 years ago, the situation looked quite different. It was about, Europe and the US both at low levels of renewable energy. Right? It was not a given that Europe would go get this breakthrough. So I'd like to hear your thoughts a bit here about what are the political, the economic reasons that led Europe to do so well, at least relatively speaking, to other parts of the industrialized world. Jonas, the floor is yours. I also just want, before that, just to remind that people may ask questions here or at Illinois or Florida. Feel free to let us know. At the end, we'll have a Q&A session, but if you have anything urgent, feel free to raise that now. Jonas, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Michael, for the great setup for the conversation. You're making me now the spokesperson for the German government, defending the policy. But let me put a little bit of an academic angle to that.
Sure.
I think the key policy innovation that was critical for the European success, and in particular the German success, is the Feedin Tariff of 2000. The Feedin Tariff provided a fixed premium to renewable energy producers for 20 years and created investment certainty in a way that no other policy had done. And interestingly, our colleague Johannes Erpelleinen and Patrick Beyer, they have written on this. The interesting part how the Feed-in tariff created a big political support base was that it created lots of smaller rural renewable energy producers. So it provided economic benefits to a wide variety of interests. And that made the policy very sticky. So it stuck around and expanded. Throughout the 2000s, we saw the renewable energy tariff be expanded in terms of how much share of renewables the policymakers wanted to bring into the system. And as a result of that, renewable energy deployment grew very fast. So that kind of policy innovation was really critical to the rapid expansion of renewable energy markets in Europe. There's, of course, also a certain downside to it. The very generous benefits that the government provided renewable energy producers didn't really keep pace with the decline of technology costs. So there were sometimes money given out too much compared to where costs were heading. And now we're in this paradoxical situation where renewable energy costs are going really down, but the costs that the individual electricity consumers are bearing in terms of financing the feed-in tariffs are relatively high. But I think we'll get into these questions of backlash a little later. And the feed-in tariff has spread across the world, though in very different ways. It's the most widely used renewable energy support instrument, then followed by renewable portfolio standards.
Well, thank you very much for this. And I think the last point you mentioned, right, about the costs going down is, of course, something that is important. It is often something that has been pushed by pro-renewable energy interest groups, right, that the costs are going down and they might even continue to decline in the future. But I'd like to think also about the broader political story here, right? It's not only about costs. There's a lot of politics involved in this. And for this, I'd like to introduce our second guest, Espen Moe. So let me just briefly introduce Espen to our audiences. Espen is professor at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, NUST, in the Department of Sociology and Political Science. Like most of us, some of us, he has a PhD in political science from the University of California in Los Angeles. He has recently published two extremely relevant books, and I think just we are several to really have enjoyed reading it. One is called Renewable Energy Transformation or Fossil Fuel Backlash, Vested Interests in the Political Economy at Palgrave Macmillan, and another book co-authored with Paul Mitford called The Political Economy of Renewable Energy and Energy Security, Common Challenges and National Responses in Japan, China, and Northern Europe. So in that book, partly you mentioned that there's a lot of politics going behind most of these policies that we're seeing, right? And you also emphasize that there were a lot of vested interests that were actually opposed to renewables, and in fact, many of which are still around, right? So, beyond just focusing on the cost, which is of course an important part that explains why an industry is viable or not, I'd like to hear your thoughts about historically some of the challenges that the renewable energy industry had to face in Europe. So historically speaking, but also coming in the future, is what kind of threats are there that may loom in the background? My sense is talking often with environmentalists in Europe, there's a certain triumphalism. People are kind of believing that the battle has been won. Mm-hmm. And I think we're far from that, because again, the numbers show us that renewable is important and growing, but it's still a part of the story and not necessarily the biggest part of the story. Again, for instance, natural gas is another part of the story and so forth. So there are a lot of small stories here. And so I'd like to hear again your thoughts about historical political threats and the new ones, or perhaps the surviving ones, that we're going to face in the future. And by the way, just before that, I just want to thank you because you're in Europe, and of course it is quite late. So thank you very much for joining us at this hour.
Oh, my pleasure, and thank you for having me. And that's kind of a giant question that you asked me. I can start by answering it from my own country, Norway. We're the third biggest energy exporter in the world, and this energy is primarily oil and gas and a little bit of hydro. But the oil and gas is probably reason enough to explain why Norway has almost no wind power. I mean, you could obviously say that we have water power, so we don't need wind power. But if you look at the policies that the Norwegian government was pursuing from the 1970s onwards, when we discovered oil, we supported the oil sector. We built the petroleum sector. We did that really well. And as time passed, that petroleum sector became institutionalized. We got a Department of Petroleum and Energy instead of a Department of Energy. And the petroleum industry provides expertise when it comes to making any kind of energy policy decisions. It's the biggest employer. Statoil is the biggest company. It's the biggest industry by far. And Norwegian energy policy has, despite our reputation or self-image of being one of the cleanest and most pristine countries in the world in terms of nature, the underlying premise of Norwegian energy policy is that no one touches petroleum, and then it becomes a matter of squaring the circle. And one way of not doing that is to go for wind. Wind has been completely neglected. The way we are squaring the circle is to go for carbon capture and storage. And so if you use that story and transfer that story to other countries like Denmark, Denmark didn't have a petroleum industry. Danish wind didn't have to fight the petroleum industry. Danish wind back in 1973, when Europe or the world had its energy crisis, the oil crisis, Denmark had basically the choice between going all in for nuclear power or importing expensive energy from abroad, or creating something of his own, and eventually what they did was becoming pretty much, besides Germany, the world's foremost wind power country. And wind power was supported to such an extent in Denmark that when different governments have tried to touch wind power has itself constituted such a strong interest that policies have sort of always swayed back in the direction of wind power. So these two countries, I mean, Scandinavian neighbors, both about 5 million people, have very different interest structures, very different energy interest structures, and these have predisposed these countries in very different directions. With Germany, you had coal and you had nuclear, but as Jonas was also indicating, that you had a broad social support base and a broad political support base, and there's also some of the literature that talks about how the utility companies and the big vested interests were sort of caught off guard by German unification in 1990, and that German regulation changes that were supposed to be applied to hydropower only was a way of sneaking renewable in basically through the back door. The utility companies were focused on on the unification with East Germany, and suddenly had these regulation changes that opened the door for renewables. But in general, my story has been that in countries with very strong energy interests, it's been way harder for wind power, solar power, or other kinds of alternative energy interests to make it big. And in most countries, you have utilities, electric utilities, that are basically rooted in old and trusted ways of producing energy. Coal is reliable, nuclear power is reliable, oil is reliable, gas is reliable, and these are old, reliable, and up until now, reasonably cheap sources of energy, and the utilities had no use for renewables challenging the existing structure in the energy markets. So renewable energy has sort of always had to fight an uphill battle, but in some countries there were no strong vested interests to fight those battles with, and in those countries it has also been a lot easier for renewables to make it. But I think also in the continuation of that, I think I should say that up until now, we've sort of done the easy part. And you showed one graph comparing the European Union with the US, and what you see in the European Union is that renewables have reached somewhere around 20%. And that's been possible without making any great infrastructural changes. The states, Germany, Denmark, a number of others have instituted feed-in tariffs. or renewable portfolio standards or other kinds of systems, but the feed-in tariff has been the most effective. And then they've sort of stepped back and said that, well, we've given you the framework conditions, now we'll leave it to the actors in the market to utilize these, to exploit these. And the actors in the market did this. So, I mean, wind power increased greatly in Denmark and Germany. Solar power increased greatly in Germany. But then you get to a level where renewables increases so fast, and these are fluctuating energies, volatile energies, where they're phased in so fast that the electricity grid can no longer cope with it. And so you can maybe get up to like 20% of the electricity share. But beyond that, you'll have to start replacing the grid with smart grids. We're hoping, obviously, for improvements in battery technology, energy storage. We're hoping for better interconnectors between countries. But without that, I'm not going to say that the renewable energy revolution will fizzle out, but improving the electricity grid is a absolutely necessary component to the renewable energy transformation. And there's a lot of politics that goes into that. And I'm sure Jonas can testify to this being a problem in Germany as much as in other countries. Germany being a federal state, and the federal states, the Bundesländer, having a lot of influence on whether or not grid lines should be built or not. My country, Norway, I spoke to one of the bosses in the local utility company, and he said, one of our biggest problem is that we market the least sexy product in the world, electricity. My electricity is exactly the same as my competitor's electricity. When you get your electricity, you're not grateful or anything. You take it for granted. If you don't get your electricity, there's hell to pay. And absolutely no one likes grid lines. So he said that basically there's a lot of inbuilt resistance in the populace against grid lines destroying the natural environment and the local environment, et cetera, et cetera.
So if I may just then build on two points, one made by Jonas and one by yourself, and either of you may want to jump in, or if you want. So there's a sense that there's a need to scale back support in some places, right? With Jonas was mentioning overly generous feed-in tariffs or renewable portfolio standards. At the same time, you also mentioned that we need to increase support, but for a different kind of support. It's about renewing infrastructures. So my question then is, are the obstacles the same in both parts of that story? In the first one, it was utilities to some degree, it was coal interest and so forth. Are the challenges going to be the same? Are the same actors going to be at the table? Are the same coalitions going to have to be built to to change that? Or is it going to be a different beast, right? So you kind of alluded that it was the easy part so far, now it's the hard part. Is the hard part going to be the simple one but just a bit higher, or is it going to be fundamentally different? And here, Jonas or Espen, whoever wants to answer this question.
Well, I'll let Jonas go first. Okay, so I think that's a fantastic question that I do think I agree with Espen that we're entering a new phase of renewable energy politics, one where it's no longer about driving a wedge into the energy mix, which we did with 20%, but about systemic change. To increase the flexibility of the power system to accommodate intermittent renewable sources. And that includes both change in infrastructure, but also institutions. And my hunch how this might differ from the previous phase, it's more of a hypothesis, that the coordination challenges are higher. We need to bring more actors together to accomplish that redesign of the power system. And it's really infrastructure where, as Espen mentioned, grid integration is a big topic. So the larger the grid, the more points of renewable energy supply, the more points of energy consumption, and we can balance it out. It starts in Germany. They're building a north-south supergrid line, bringing the wind from the north to the industrial centers of the south. They have an interconnector with Norway. Norway exporting excess hydropower to Germany. And the larger that grid is, the more better it can cope with intermittency. Storage, much earlier in its development. California focuses more on storage than grid integration because building power lines in the US is even harder than in Europe. So that's a 20-year story, not a 10-year story. I think that does require significant level of political coordination and probably then a crafting of broader alliances. I think it can go either way. As renewable energies have expanded, they have also created more and more allies. I've seen steel companies advertise their steel as the steel for the smart grid. That definitely was not the case 10, 20 years ago. And Germany has just been going through a redesign of the general power market regulation to incentivize these flexibility options. And you asked, are we needing the same kinds of subsidies? And here Germany is taking a different path. They're not providing mandates and direct subsidies for storage or for grid integration. They're pursuing the path of the energy-only market, where they try to incentivize it through market incentives. And we don't really know yet how well that will work. California is taking a different path. They are more hands-on. They have given electric utilities a storage mandate. You need to provide that much storage by target X. So we see, I think, different levels of state intervention, state support for this type of systemic change in the energy grid.
And I think you also left out another type of coordination, which is state-to-state coordination. So the European Union has this goal of bringing interconnectors up to 10%. And some European countries are at 10%, but many European countries are not at 10%. And even those that are, well, 10% is not that high a number. So, I mean, when you talk about solar in Germany being in the south and wind being in the north, and you need transmission lines between the north and the south. Well, we need these transmission lines between countries as well, so that's yet another coordination issue. And these coordination issues are even slower than the domestic coordination issues. I think that the utility companies will be crucial to this development. I mean, different countries have organized this differently. So in some countries you have utility companies, in some countries you have grid companies. But it's definitely also the case that the renewable transformation, the renewable revolution is challenging the business model of the utility companies. So once again, we did the easy part of the job by giving Feedin Tariffs or renewable portfolio standards, but these support systems basically ruined the business model of the utility companies, and the utility companies are one of the most crucial actors in this transformation. So we can't let these actors go bankrupt, even though to a lot of environmentalists they're sort of bad guys. I mean, they obviously aren't bad guys, but we think of them as a block against change, and they're a crucial part of that change. And how to solve that is a huge problem in so many countries. And we see the utility companies being sort of at the core of these developments and these problems, not just in Europe, but in Japan, in China, in the US, pretty much everywhere.
And in fact, the general question of why, I mean, you mentioned utilities in Germany before, right? That they kind of were caught by surprise in some sense. But knowing now that many of them are going bankrupt, it's one of the questions that I always have is why, unlike other actors that have not been more, we're so myopic given the fundamental forces going on. But that might be just explaining that after the fact. Let me now perhaps zoom towards the US more as well, because That's going to be one big part of of this conversation. And for this, I'd like to turn to Shanti Gambar-Ravindran. Thank you very much for joining us. Shanti is Associate Professor of Environment, Energy, and Development Economics at GESPIA, our public policy school. She has a PhD in economics from the MIT, and she has recently edited a new book called The Shale Dilemma, a global perspective on the political, economic, and scientific issues surrounding fracking and shale development. Now, shale gas, of course, a very important topic, especially here in Pennsylvania. I remember at the time when I came here for my job talk, I had this interesting stuff on trades. Nobody was interested in that. People always asked me about shale, if I had anything to say about shale gas. And so let me try to build on your work. So we had an earlier conversation, and you had raised some issues about current energy and climate policy making in the US, right? And so I'd like to hear a bit more about your thoughts in terms of some of the challenges that are currently faced by the renewable energy sector in the US. Even though the share of global emissions of the US is going down, it is still one of the largest emitters of carbon dioxide emissions. We've seen before that the path has not been the same in the US and in the European Union. And so I want to hear a bit more about your thoughts about current obstacles that this industry is currently facing here in the US.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to be more optimistic and take the opportunity side first.
Okay,
right?
Sure.
And I'm going to build off Jonas's observation that what really helped Germany was building a wide interest group, and that allowed for policy stickiness, right? So it was in Germany they had benefits to individual households that contributed to renewable energy cooperatives, right? So that was a big interest group. We actually have this same pattern in the US. So I'm thinking about wind, right? Where do we have the greatest wind energy? Texas, right? Most people, if I ask them what does Texas have, it's oil and gas. They forget that Texas also is the tremendous powerhouse of wind. And I think that example is great because it shows you that there was a window of opportunity for economic benefits to a wide variety of players, and that made the wind energy take hold, right? So the rural landowners, they get royalty from having wind turbines on their farms. So this is great. So a bunch of governors got together, Kansas, Iowa, kind of like you think red states, right? And they got together and wrote to President Trump that no, he has to support renewables because renewables is the backbone of rural America. Rural Midwest America, right? You can't get more red than that. So I think that's something we have to keep in mind, that we do have these opportunities. Then another thing in Texas that happened was people realized that oil and gas prices are volatile. So the utility firms themselves wanted to have wind in order to have a better diversification of their portfolio, and therefore they encouraged wind. And our great President Bush was the one who pushed forward a tax credit that allowed for the building of transmission from West Texas to East Texas. So hooray for Republicans. We actually made tremendous progress, right? So I think we need to thinking about opportunities for where do we get policy opportunities at the ground level for the private sector, and trying to, that's where you're going to see the expansion of renewables. And okay, now that I've given you the bright light, the one good thing about the US is we do have this multi-level governance structure, right? So you can have the federal government pursuing one policy, but the state level actors are pursuing a variety of policy, and they do have lots of policy experimentation. Local actors are taking, Pittsburgh mayor said we're not like the rest. We're not like, I don't know what Trump said, but he said we're going to do lots of renewables. So there is a lot of opportunities there. Now the risk side. I think the problem is on the private goods aspect of renewables, we can identify all these interest groups that might push it forward. On the public good aspect of renewables, we have the same problem that Aspen brought up and that Jonas brought up. How are we going to build the transmission grids? That's the key problem, right? So there are people who are trying to work out ways in which you can incentivize landowners to actually hold on to host grids, right? So just like we have payment to landowners for hosting turbines, can we figure out payment schemes for landowners where when they're going to have to host grid transmission and not just kind of elbow our way in building grids, but trying to get more cooperation. And what the problem with the US is we have interstate transmission grids and we don't have eminent domain for these companies. And just as a side note, for shale companies building oil pipelines, they do have eminent domain, right? So fundamental problem with the structure that we have, building on the point that Aspen brought up, that if you have oil and gas as your main competitor, you do have these policies that are inherently discriminatory towards the new guys, right? So that's a problem. But the way the renewable energy has to proceed is that there's no way you're going to get eminent domain. You need to figure out what is the cooperative structure. And for interstate transmission lines, we need to think about ramping in and ramping off for the pass-through states, right? You can't just build a grid and expect people to let you build grids and have no benefits to the local market. So we have to think about things like that. I think those are the fundamental issues. Okay, then I'm sure you guys want to know, okay, what about this Trump guy? That I think is somehow, when you talk to energy companies, the horizon is long. When you make investment decisions, the horizons are long. They're not going to be, blown by the latest wind. Okay. So I have PJM, which is a company that has the grid in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and a bunch of other places. They have a projection that they will grow to 20% renewables, and they are keeping to this regardless, because they said that our time horizon for planning is very long. We're not going to change based on non-market fundamentals. And they actually think they can do reliability till 20% renewables, which is quite good because we're now only at 6% on the PJM grid. So we haven't come to the difficult problem yet. In terms of the immediate problem with the Trump policy, yes, I agree. There's a problem with the solar tariff, and there's a problem with requiring imports requiring US-made steel for wind turbine. What we forget is that we are in a global supply chain, right? So if we have a tariff on one section of the global supply chain, we are going to hurt on every other part of the chain. And my hope is that people on every part of the chain, the manufacturers on every part of the chain, and the companies on every other part of the chain is going to be the vested interest, which would compete with the interest group that is pushing for this tariff. So that's, my hopeful view on this, and I can give you a reason to be hopeful. So we recently had DOE propose to the FERC, the Federal Electricity Regulatory Commission, a crazy proposal, so crazy that it had no basis to it, right? The one where you're going to subsidize nuclear and coal because they're the only ones who can keep 90 days storage. And there's no rhyme or reason to that proposal except for blatant subsidy. And they had to back down. The entire FERC commission, all of them are Republican nominated, except for one Democrat, and they did kill off the proposal. So I think there is hope that vested interest in the positive policies for renewables might be able to ride it out. Okay, but I'm an optimist.
So let me just build on this and go back to Jonas first. So Jonas, you've written extensively about finding allies to build good energy policies or pro-renewable energy policies. You've also written a lot about how to sequence them, right, to make them work. When you think about the case of the US, you live on the West Coast. Can you think about the kind of alliances that have been successful so far in the US? You alluded to certain rural areas in the Midwest. What kind of coalitions can you build? Because of course these might look quite different from the ones in Germany, right, where you had Bavarian farmers aligned with people from the north, right? It's not going to look exactly the same. So what kind of alliances, if you're an activist, for instance, right, where would you start to look for allies in the US?
For renewables in the power sector?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Or
it's
if you want to
really
broaden
very.
up,
Sorry?
if you want to broaden it to energy in general, feel free. But I was thinking of the renewable, the electricity sector.
I think it's hard to generalize it. It's very context depending. So let me give you a few examples. And it evolves over time. So it depends a lot on what is the structure of the economy, which potential interests in the economy could be kind of pulled into a renewable energy future. And in Germany, that evolved over time. Initially, it was just the farmers, yes, but then as that a nascent industry was available in Germany, the entire tool and equipment manufacturers that were producing machinery for producing solar panels, wind turbines, which were an ingrained political lobby, they jumped on the bandwagon and said, well, we actually can sell more machines if we start producing solar and wind in Germany. In California, it's not that much of an industrial story. It's more of an electric utility story where over time the electric utilities began investing in renewable electricity and their interest reshaped. Suddenly they were invested with capital in that future. And when there was an effort to repeal California's Global Warming Solutions Act, which had direct implications for how much renewable energy they would have to be deployed. Utilities fought against the repeal. They said, we have invested in that future. We are now okay with it. So you see this kind of configurations changing over time. Then in some of the southern states, we see an interesting bridge across the progressive conservative divide, with a Green Tea Party having emerged that ties libertarian values of consumer choice. I want to decide where I get my electricity from, plus the idea of kind of generating economic income through your rooftop solar installation, has really mobilized alongside more environmentalist causes to maintain renewable energy policies. So those are the kinds of alliances. And going beyond the power sector to the transport sector, in the US, we have seen an interesting alliance between those pushing for advanced transport technologies from an environmental perspective, along with national security interests that have an interest in reducing the imports of oil, especially after 9/11. National security interests were very much in favor of anything technologically that did not require Middle East oil imports. So there's a variety of these across economic interests, but also between economic and social interests to create these alliances.
And I think that's really interesting and important, right? Is that the opportunities to create alliances across groups that you otherwise would not necessarily think as being willing to align is quite remarkable. As you were saying, so Germany, with the case in the US, that we have groups that we generally don't think going well together, that suddenly can actually create these bridges. You can create these bridges and reach out. And I think that's something, for people who are activists, is something important to remember. Let me now zoom out a bit, and I want to build in a second on the story about trade, because I think trade is an important part of what is currently going on in or some of the threats that are faced by the renewable energy industry. But I want first to go back to Espen. You have studied renewable energy extensively in Japan, China, and elsewhere. And I was wondering if you could just give us a bit of background, because we tend to be very centered on Europe and the US for some of these discussions. Get a sense of what the scope of the debate about renewable energy and what the state of the renewable energy industry is in places like China, right? Some of the largest renewable energy producers are located there, both in sun and in wind power. Mm-hmm. And so I just want to, if you could get us a sense, for those of us who are not necessarily very familiar with these backgrounds, a bit of sense of what the situation is. Mm-hmm. Is the mood optimistic, or is the mood on the cautious side?
Yeah. Why don't I say like a couple of words on the U.S. first, since we're
Yeah,
talking about the U.S. in any case, and it's very interesting to listen to both Jonas and Shanti emphasize the state level. And the state level is sort of both the blessing and the curse for the U.S. because you have different policies and different actors and different alliances on the state level. But obviously, grids are larger than they're not on the state level, and federal policies are obviously also not on the state level. So where Jonas and I have emphasized the feed-in tariff for Germany and Denmark, the U.S. never had such a thing. Instead, they had the production tax credit, and that has been repealed and abolished at least 4 times in the past 20 years. So whereas European countries, at least some European countries, have had fairly steady support systems, the U.S. support system has been start, stop, start, stop, start, stop, slightly longer period, stop, start again. And while you have vibrant industries and probably number one in the world in terms of innovation, this creates uncertainty for these industries. China and Japan. China is, I mean, a lot of people are basically China when it comes to renewables these days, because China keeps breaking every single renewable record every single year. And I think they broke their own solar PV record of 2016 by another 50% in 2017. So there's absolutely no doubt that China is going very deliberately for both solar power and wind power. And I think one of the areas in which it is legitimate to criticize, I'm not going to say the Communist Party, but in which areas you can criticize the Chinese state is within the environment, because it doesn't challenge the monopoly of the Communist Party, it doesn't challenge the system, and everyone knows that the environment and the air pollution in Beijing and Shanghai and all these cities has been atrocious for so many years. It's one of those things that reduces the legitimacy of the Communist Party, and that's something they take very seriously. And China also realized that they will be hit hard by global warming. And they realize that this is an opportunity to gain the upper hand within what they perceive of as growth industries for the future. So for China, there are a lot of factors that go together, and they all tell China that renewable energy is something they should go for, both in the sense of deployment and in the sense of industrial development. Now, the main problem in China is that, and Westerners often think that the Communist Party in Beijing is almighty, and Xi Jinping just has to make a decision and then everyone just mysteriously, magically implements it. But China is a big country, and party bosses in the districts have oftentimes had a very loose relationship with Beijing. And what you see in the districts and out in the regions is that especially a number of, or especially some of the provinces are extremely coal heavy and extremely coal intensive. And even though the Communist Party is very serious about renewable energy, when push comes to shove out in the regions, out in the provinces, what you see is that the biggest industrial actor are the coal actors, and the utility companies and the grid companies, and for them, coal is easy profits. There are also close relationships between the coal mining bosses, the coal industry bosses, and the party bosses. So there's quite a bit of collusion there. So by all means, you see extremely impressive installation figures of Chinese renewables, and once again, it's definitely a very sincere and earnest effort on the part of the central government in Beijing. But you don't really have to scratch that far beneath the surface before you see that you basically have the same interest battles in a communist economy as you do in most Western economies, and the players are pretty much the same players, and they're fighting. The constellations are pretty much the same constellations. Japan is another very interesting case. So, I mean, China is still partly a developing country, so we can't expect them to have grid lines that are the same standard as smaller and far more developed countries in Europe, as well as the US. So grid lines is an obvious problem in China. Grid lines is also an obvious problem in Japan. And whereas Americans complain about their grid lines, Europeans compare about their grid lines, well, the Japanese are looking to Europe and saying that, well, in Europe at least you have 400 million people tied together in sort of a common European grid line system. In Japan, you have 120 million people, country basically the size of Norway geographically, and obviously they can't draw on power from China or from Korea or from Taiwan, both for political reasons and obviously geographical reasons. So self-sufficiency concerns and energy security concerns weigh a lot more heavily in Japan, and for that reason, nuclear was always the preferred solution of METI. And before Fukushima, METI had this plan that nuclear would be increased from 30% of the electricity to 50%. Obviously, then Fukushima happened, and all those plans fell by the wayside, and at some stage, every single nuclear plant was shut down. And in the meantime, Japan instituted what was at the time probably the most generous feed-in tariff in the world, led to the Japanese solar PV market growing by 100-fold in only 2 or 3 years, and the Japanese market becoming the second and the third biggest in the world in only 2 or 3 years. And so Japan has ramped up its installations of solar PV dramatically. But what we also see is that it has not happened with respect to wind power. So with respect to wind power, the utilities have been fighting them in exactly the same way as they were before Fukushima. Utilities basically arguing that wind power just destroys the grid. And the Japanese grid system up until now has not even been one nationwide Japanese grid system, but been divided basically into 10 regional monopolies. Now, since Fukushima, Japan has been changing this around liberalization of the system, but up until very recently, 10 regional monopolies with only very strong, only very weak interlinkages between themselves. So when you had a nuclear accident in one part of the country, well, they could not automatically take for granted that other parts of the country would be able to ship electricity to that conflicted area. And so what you see with Fukushima is that the so-called nuclear village is definitely dramatically weakened, and once again, solar power increased by 100-fold in only a couple of years. But what you see now, 7 years after Fukushima, is this steady sort of clawback, fight back from the utility companies, from the nuclear village, aided by an LDP government with a pro-nuclear prime minister, Abe. And what you're seeing is the utility companies also sometimes restricting solar PV and saying, well, our grid simply can't accept this much solar PV, and basically just shutting it off. So Japan is an extremely interesting case because of its geographical complications. It's an island, extremely densely populated island, with only reasonably okay relationships with its neighbors. And an energy structure that relies on, well, they basically have very little, well, they have some coal, and they're increasing their domestic production of coal for energy security reasons. Obviously, that means their Kyoto obligations have long vanished, so they have absolutely no way of complying with those anymore. But it also tells you about a country that used to have the strongest vested interest in the developed world, I think, with extremely strong utility companies. And even though the system is being liberalized, deregulated, the old actors are still very much clawing their powers back and trying to still keep one hand on the steering wheel. So, but once again, you see that energy structures and vested interest structures very much predispose countries in certain directions. In Japan, it's been towards solar power, but not wind power. Partly it's because there isn't that much space available for wind power, but partly it's also because the government early on, going back 20, 30 years, conceived of solar power as a potential alternative energy and a potential export industry for Japan. This kind of was also, this was part of the backstory for the feed-in tariff in 2011. But also the very generous feed-in tariff meant that when Japan suddenly became the second or the third largest market for solar PV, almost half of those solar panels were Chinese solar panels. And it's an expensive feed-in tariff, and you're basically subsidizing the Chinese industry, and that's not good for not good for employment. It's not good for politics, and so obviously there are limits to how long you can keep that going.
So let me then build on this, on the part about the last part of what you were talking, especially with respect to trade, right? So, the solar panels in China are partly a domestic story, but it's also an international story. And in fact, that's what's currently going on with the trade issues. So in fact, I'd like to go back to Shanti and Jonas and think about the current threats coming from these trade conflicts. So President Trump has announced an increase in tariffs on solar panels. You mentioned also very briefly steel is also part of that story. So I'd like to hear both of your thoughts in terms of, first of all, what are what is the motivation behind that? Why is this happening? Because and what the consequences will be, right? So why is this happening? What are the consequences? And then also, Jonas, you've been doing a lot of work on integrated supply chain and things like firms operating in different countries, producing different parts at different stages. And so what should we expect here? Should we expect more trade conflicts with respect to renewable energy? And if so, is that going to be another major threat in the future?
Okay, I'll tell you what I think is rather very curious about what's going on, right? So it's not a clear story to me at all that the tariffs are for protecting domestic interests, right? So the first, the current tariff is really worrying because the action came under this pretty obscure part of the Trade Act. So the tariffs can be put on all solar manufacturers, not just on the ones for dumping. So this particular action on the tariff is really worrying. There was another previous one where it was targeting only specific manufacturers of tariffs. But the current one, the remedy that's given out because of this obscure provision is to all solar panel manufacturers. So it's a very unsophisticated tool. Even if one wanted to achieve a level playing field between US and potential dumpers. So I don't really understand, to be honest, what the gain is and why this story has been able to take root when the manufacturer that's complaining is majority Chinese owned, right? So it's all very, very confusing. Like it doesn't answer to the one that's really redneck. I want to protect American jobs, but in reality, it's hurting American jobs because a lot of our jobs is in installation, right? And the other part of the supply chain is, think about the US manufacturing. It's not the most cost effective, right? Where is our comparative advantage? Our comparative advantage is really in the technology of like demand response, all that stuff. And so if you contract the installation sector, you're having a negative impact on all these other sectors, which is demand response, which is kind of the place where US can have a competitive advantage because it's driven by technology and not by cost. So these are the questions that I had for Jonas. Like, so do you see what the political story is?
Okay, so on the consequences, I absolutely agree with you. It does not help U.S. jobs. But why is this happening? I think it's good to step back and say renewable energy is not just about climate mitigation. This is a global race for competitiveness as countries see this as a growth sector. And we have seen a rise of protectionist measures across the world. So what happened yesterday is very noteworthy because it's a high tariff, it's the United States, but we have seen these trade disputes between lots of countries. We see other protectionist measures, especially local content rules proliferate across the emerging world, where these countries require that any renewable technology sold in their territory have some locally made components. So there is a trend towards various protectionist measures in renewable energy markets. Why is this happening? So what's important to understand is that this is opposed by the majority of the industry in both the United States but also Europe. It's really a few manufacturers that US manufacturers that are suffering from Chinese imports that are in favor of it. And they find a pretty opportune structure in US trade law. US trade law makes it very easy, has very low barriers for companies that feel threatened by international imports to get protection. And the ease of that law is, of course, to claim injury is, of course, helped by an administration that does want to make a statement on protecting U.S. industry. So I think we find this, the trade law, the structure of it, plus a very protectionist-oriented administration to really allow for what happened yesterday. And a lot of people coming more from the legal side suggest reforms of U.S. trade law to account for the reality of these global supply chains. And that leads me to the point about consequences. Does this help U.S. Jobs? Does this help renewable energy? So, as Shanti clearly said, we're embedded in global supply chains, and the U.S. economy needs to ask the question, where do we have comparative advantages in the supply chain? And increasingly, it's not in the production of modules, which have become a very commoditized product, and it's all about price, and their Chinese imports are just better. But on the upstream side, again, where we produce machinery that helps produce solar panels or polysilicon, high-quality polysilicon, a key input factor to solar panels, and on the downside, the project developers. And these two components are suffering. China assumed retaliatory action on polysilicon, so we had one polysilicon producer going bankrupt. And on the producer side, on the project developer side, they project a slowing of deployment of solar modules in the US for the next 2-3 years, because it's just gotten a little more expensive. But then in the medium to long term, the tariff will fade out, but also companies find ways to work around it, or the market finds ways to work around it. So I think it will have a moderate negative impact on renewable deployment with not much help on the job side.
So before I open the discussion to questions from the audience, do you get a sense whether we should expect more of these trades wars over renewable energy or more generally in the future, or is that just a one-off kind of mostly a signal to Trump's voters that motivated that decision? Will we see more of these, or?
We will see. My hunch is we'll see more of this, not just in the US, but globally, right, as long as there's not globally major legal reform.
So Jonas, you mentioned that the administration was taking advantage. It wants the ability to make a statement on protecting industry, U.S. industry, and that was a strong motivation factor. So I know that they're trying to make the statement, but the facts of the case does not help them, right? Or is the administration counting that people don't really know the story and they'll just accept whatever twist the administration is putting on the story? And the reason I ask this is because Suniva is actually majority Chinese owned, right? So this American story doesn't really, pass muster. So what's your sense, Jonas?
We
No,
lost-
we lost him.
Yes.
Oh, no.
That was a very bad question. All right. Well, let's hopefully we'll be able to join us very shortly. I think this is now a good time to open up.
I can't hear you anymore.
Can you hear us now?
Yeah, now you're back. Okay.
Okay. All right. So Shani wanted to ask you a question, and then we'll open the questions from the floor.
Right. So did you hear the question about the fact that the administration is trying to use this as a statement, but in reality, the facts of the case is the Chinese-owned company? So how do they think they'll get away with this?
I think the fact that it doesn't really create jobs in the broader set across the supply chain is an important fact. But I think to me it's more of a question: are certain jobs politically more salient than others? And industry, manufacturing jobs have been a focus of the Trump administration. I don't know if they just get more political attention and interest than jobs on the project developer side. Sunaiva was Chinese-owned, SolarWorld, German-owned, are the two companies behind the case. I'm not particularly familiar with the backstory, what the Chinese, what kind of investors those are, and how that plays into the politics.
All right. So let us now, if there are questions, we also, if people in Florida or Illinois also have questions, they should feel free to reach out. The panelists as well, you have started the trend by asking each other questions. So I open the floor. Here you go.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. This is a really great discussion. I wanted to, as the director of the EU Center here, bring it back to the discussion of it back to Europe and the EU. And Espen, at some point you did mention sort of the role of the EU in talking about Gridlines. But I wonder if, and whoever wants to sort of take this, if we could talk a little bit about sort of what role the European Union as sort of the supranational actor can take in promoting renewables, whatever those may be, and sort of use that, in terms of that as an opportunity to kind of get past some of these issues that have been raised at the nation state level, at sort of the subnational level in places where we have federal systems like that. So whoever would like to jump in.
Well, I can start by saying that having the European Union at least represents a great opportunity to make this into more than nation states. We desperately need to move the system boundaries out from the nation state to the region and then eventually globally, and at least the European Union has political tools that allow that to happen. But what we're also seeing is that Germany is going away from the feed-in tariff, but during the days when the feed-in tariff was in full flow, there was this there was tension between the German system of feed-in tariffs and the European Union emissions trading scheme. And the argument that these systems were basically hitting each other on the head, and that you could have one of these systems, but not both together. And now that a number of countries are going away from the feed-in tariffs and relying ever more on the European emissions trading scheme, and tendering and bidding type things, what becomes an obvious problem is if the European emissions trading scheme allows too many quotas, allowing the price on carbon to drop towards zero, which historically it's done way too often. In which case, what the ETS basically does is nothing beyond what technological progress is already doing. But the European Union is also doing things in terms of creating better infrastructure, or at least incentivizing better infrastructure, and is doing things to tie the European electricity markets together. So once again, talking about my own country, what is going on in Norway right now is that we're building subsea cables to Germany and to the United Kingdom. And this is a huge issue in Norway because a lot of people fear that we will basically be selling our hydroelectric power to Europe for a far higher electricity price than what Norwegian consumers would normally pay for it. And that the electricity companies, utility companies, and the grid companies would prefer to sell our renewable electricity to foreign countries instead of to Norwegian consumers. So for Norwegians, or at least Norwegian industry and Norwegian consumers, this European Union pulling the European countries together in one electricity system is also perceived as a threat that might increase electricity prices for Norwegian industry. And Norwegian industry relies on hydroelectric power, so it's green industry, or I mean, it's the greenest energy-intensive industries in Europe. And so while I keep advocating that we should shift the system boundaries from the national level to the international level, this also comes with a lot of challenges for the different nations. And my nation is one of those that definitely feel those challenges and hasn't really resolved how to deal with those. I'm not really sure if that was the answer to your question or an answer to a completely different question, but that was the direction in which I took it.
Thank you. Other thoughts, other questions?
I had a question either for Espen or Jonas, and it was about how we were talking about how the share of sustainable energy has kind of reached a plateau in Europe of somewhere around the mid-20s, and how we've done the easy part, and now we're kind of getting to the harder part of changing infrastructure and things like that, and that's why a lot of people don't see that that sustainable energy taking a bigger percentage of energy production. But I was wondering if it's also part of the reason it's sort of plateaued is that we continue to find new oil and natural gas deposits that the existing infrastructure can use. So there's a lot of new discoveries in the Eastern Mediterranean and investment in pipelines that are going to go from the Levant to Cyprus and through Greece and Italy up into European markets, and whether the ease of accessing those petroleum deposits is part of also why people are less motivated to make the difficult investments and difficult decisions to allow sustainable energy to produce a greater percentage of the electrical power.
I can give it a try. My hunch is that that might not be an important factor for a few reasons. First, oil doesn't play a role in the electricity sector in Europe. Gas does, and they actually want to get more gas into electricity mix. Compared to the US, the price relationship between coal and gas is inverse in Europe. Coal is still cheaper than gas, while gas is much cheaper here. So the real problem is competitor to renewables is still coal, where we have abundant resources still in Germany, and finding a way to get coal out of the system. There is room for expansion of gas alongside with renewables. Also, the easier ramping up, ramping down times of gas complement renewables. So I don't think that new fossil fuel discoveries are a real challenge to renewables in Europe, which might be different in the US with the shale gas boom.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I kind of agree with that too. I mean, 5 years ago, we talked about an energy crisis, an impending energy crisis, and today we're sort of awash in petroleum once again, but that seems to have affected other continents more than Europe. But I think there's also another factor that we kind of keep forgetting, and it's the one that a number of European countries are still sort of stuck in the financial crisis. And before the financial crisis, a number of southern European countries were part of the renewable energy boom, and they were having all these arguments about green industrial growth, and had extremely generous feed-in tariff for solar PV and wind power, et cetera, et cetera. And then the financial crisis came, some of these countries kept their feed-in tariffs for a while, and realized, like Japan is realizing right now, that green industrial growth became solar power growth in China, not in Spain, not in Italy, and that these became extremely heavily subsidized industrial jobs, and not that many of those. And I'm a firm believer in the economics of Josef Schumpeter, and Josef Schumpeter says that you should never waste an economic crisis or a financial crisis, but especially Southern Europe has basically sort of desperately tried to hold on to whatever industrial jobs they already had, and not kind of embracing renewables and whatever future technologies and future industries there were. So they've been afraid of letting go and afraid of going wholeheartedly into renewables. So there was a revolution, and in a number of countries it stalled. And that's also part of the picture.
I actually had a question related to some of Europe's bigger baseload suppliers, and I'm always curious about what the future prospects for nuclear might be, because there's such a disparity between different energy portfolios. You've got a country like France where it provides something like 75% of their power, versus others that use virtually no nuclear, or people that are working to phase it out. So for both Espen and Jonas, where do you see the future of nuclear in Europe with respect to baseload generation? I think I said nuclear. I meant nuclear.
Who wants to take
You
it?
Yeah.
You want to go first?
No, you go first.
You go first. Well, I mean, my limited knowledge about recent nuclear policies is that I don't know that any European country is expanding it. Italy has phased it out. Germany is phasing out. Switzerland is phasing out. France is reducing to 50%. So it will be in the base load as long as the existing nuclear power plants can run. What are you?
Espen, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, I think some of the reactions in Europe to Fukushima were kind of knee-jerk. Germans saying that, well, if the Japanese can't do nuclear, then who can? Completely forgetting that Japan is probably the stupidest country in the world to put put massive amounts of nuclear plants. I mean, with their geology and fault lines, etc., etc. So from an energy point of view and from a climate point of view, there is certainly still a rationale for nuclear power, but at the same time, what Jonas was saying is something I agree wholeheartedly with. It doesn't look as if any of the European powers are interested in more than just basically staying with the nuclear that they have until they have to phase nuclear plants out for age reasons. So it's very hard to see any of these countries building any new nuclear plants, and they will phase them out rather than phase them in.
I was going to say that the UK won, but the UK is, of course, soon, no longer in use soon enough.
Would you give, what's your sense of why did the UK decide to do that nuclear plant with Chinese financing? Like when the rest of EU kind of decided not to.
I'm not that big of an expert on either nuclear politics or British politics, but what Britain has had is a bit of start-stop with respect to, well, there's a bit of market, there's a bit of regulation, and there's a bit of market, and then there's a bit of regulation again, and they haven't seemed to be able to come to an agreement with itself as to whether or not nuclear or renewable energy is something that should happen through market mechanisms or regulations, whether it's something that the UK should go for at all. and if they shouldn't go for it at all, maybe they should stick with the nuclear that they have or expand that. So it seems to be a country that is not united, and obviously it's the country that has the party system in Europe that looks the most like the US. So you have a Labour Party and a Conservative Party that are way more polarized today than they were polarized in the 1970s by all means, but they're way more polarized now than in the 1990s, for instance. And that goes for energy issues as well as other political issues. But that's me winging it.
That's very good. I think, except if there are other questions, I think we're reaching the end of that time. Thank you so much for joining us, Espen. It was
My
a pleasure. I would love to thank, I'll thank Johanna separately, I think, when it comes out. Thank you, Kandi, as well.
Thanks to the EU Center, like this is extremely helpful.
Well, yeah, thank you, of course, naturally, to the European Studies Center and to the partners as well in Florida and Illinois. Thank you, Alison, for organizing everything. And thank you to the audience member. Thank you for coming here and asking those questions. And I look forward to hearing from you in separate conversation. Again, thank you, Espen. Have a good night.
Thanks. Same to you. Bye.